do you think that gay couples should be allowed to adopt at all?
No. The family still exists as a natural thing. And even when we're talking about adopted families, it's still most healthy, as we see, to mirror, well, that's not the word, to create these families on the natural model. Because biologically, we are created to be raised by a mother and a father. And the absence of either the male or the female influence is detrimental to human development. And then just in general, as a social question.
Is there solid evidence on that?
There's certainly evidence statistically. There have been studies that depression is significantly higher among children of same-sex parents, obesity, suicidal ideation.
You're talking about the study Invisible Victims, Delayed Onset Depression Among Adults with Same-Sex Parents.
Right, that's one important study, yes.
Right, that study was directly challenged by other people in the field, and this is to be expected, right? Like, people in the field of science are naturally going to support certain social causes. We consider them to be naturally to the left. I think that that's fair game. But that was directly challenged. I mean, the guy who did that study himself, Catholic priest, like he's actually in the church, right? So you have that to consider. And then you also have to consider the samples that they looked at. They were looking at children who were with same-sex couples starting at age 12 to 18, not kids who were raised in same-sex families at all. That matters a great deal because you're talking about people who were in unstable families. Maybe they had a mom and a dad and then they changed teams, right? And they start dating same-sex instead. That's unstable, and that's going to be challenging for any child. But that's not the same as raising a child with you the entirety of their life.
Right. I mean, and a lot of it, there's the statistical and quantitative debate is entirely unsettled right now because this is something that we haven't been doing for very long. It's not a question that we have a firm answer to whether quantitatively it is absolutely worse for children to be raised by two parents of the same sex. And frankly, I don't want to wait to find out. I don't see why we would experiment with children's well-being. But getting back to the secondary point, we see the social costs in the breakdown of the family when we normalize unnatural family structures. We see, as Nate has suggested a couple minutes ago, it's a slippery slope. The entire sexual revolution ethic is. And when there's no actual compelling reason for the good of anybody involved besides, personal happiness, turning a child into a means to personal fulfillment, I don't see any reason why we should normalize it as a social practice.
And I mean, I think the question now, right, moving beyond the debate over issues that I think are essentially settled, and this, again, might be where I'm more moderate than Declan is, the sexual revolution is upon us. It might have been a mistake, but it's here. And we have, multiple generations now that have been raised in an ethic that would have been unrecognizable to sort of most generations in Western civilization when it comes to sexuality. So how are conservatives, and particularly social conservatives or conservatives who have a sort of socially right-leaning bent on cultural issues, how are we to respond? And that's where the conversation, I think, gets diverse and interesting, because you, as much as it is not satisfying to say, and it will get you accused of sort of being a squish on Twitter, you have to accommodate things to a certain extent if you want to stop the worst things from happening. And some, I think, conservatives, some social conservatives, and I consider myself a social conservative, so this is a critique of people on my own side, would prefer to kind of just stand back and throw arrows at our culture, but we actually have to figure out how to engage with the sexual revolution because it has transformed our society. There are socially conservative principles that we can use to engage with it, but it is true that we are not going to go back to 1950. So how do we recover family life as best we can with the less than perfect circumstances?
Well, I mean, the opinion that I've always had on recovering family life is we allow people to form
and that's an opinion. It's defensible in that context.
I think for me, whenever I hear all this broken down, it is wanting people to live lives without meaning, to be nomads, to drift from person to person and not be able to get anchored in a household, in a family. The idea that children are used by gay couples purely as commodities, like a car or a fancy handbag, I think that seems to be a cheap version of these people and everybody are always looking for meaning in their lives.
No, I
And
don't
there's
think that's
nothing,
true. No.
There's nothing that gives you more meaning than the sacrifice of raising a child in a very selfish culture. I think that that's a noble thing to want to do.
I agree. I agree with
You,
that.
you,
But
I mean,
Declan
you,
might
you
not.
referred to it as a
I
commodity.
mean, sure. There's a. I never said commodity.
Well, what's the right word?
It's a means to personal fulfillment, and that you should not view responsibility as a means to fulfillment. You don't carry out responsibilities because it makes you feel good. You carry out responsibilities because they are responsibilities, and maybe in a vacuum you could say that two men absolutely in a vacuum you could say that two men taking in a child and caring for him when nobody else will is an absolute moral good, no question. But these things don't happen in a vacuum. There are social costs to be balanced out, and we need to understand these things in context. There are moral dimensions beyond just taking care of a child. It's just unavoidable that the progress of the sexual revolution, which goes on through Obergefell and into gay adoption, undermines the family. It does not strengthen it just because more people are saying that they belong to families.
The question, though, and I think this is where the argument that Stephen's making is most powerful, right, is, okay, yes, that happened, right? So how do we, again, recover family life as best we can given the circumstances? And one argument is that it is better to have unconventional families than to have no families at all. There's arguments against that, but I'm saying...
And pair that with a rollback of no-fault divorce. If I have one instinct...
Gay marriage, but no divorce.
No, if I have like one strong instinct to go along with the guys at this table, it's I want no-fault divorce to be a thing of the past and for it to be an incredibly painful and costly thing for anybody to want to do once you have signed on to being part of a married family. I think it's been disastrous for society, and we pretty much just did it to enrich the American Bar Association, just because they lobbied effectively